Thank you for having me, and it's a pleasure to be here and to see so many people that I know and who I feel are sort of foot soldiers on a journey together. There is a real logic in me following from Philip's speech today. I forget the exact title of this talk. I think it's something like Indoctrination in Schools, a Legal Analysis. Now, that's already riddled with problems, and I speak as a practicing barrister. Well, obviously, as a legal professional, one expects some sort of legal analysis. In fact, that's what you go to barristers for. The problem that we have, and I'd like to try and tackle this in my talk today, is that much of the time, when we're tackling issues such as indoctrination, for example, we're not actually dealing with law at all. What we're dealing with is the dismantling of traditional legal structures and established legal principles, and I do speak from the position of someone who practices in the Anglosphere, so I'm dealing with what I understand to be a framework for understanding our legal system, which we could name the rule of law very, very broadly. And I'll talk a little bit in a moment about what I mean by the rule of law. But the rule of law and the common law principles that derive from our uncodified constitution, these have all been basically thrown under a bus, and they've been thrown under a bus very quickly. And so very often when we're talking about cultural issues and some of the debates that many of us keep coming up against again and again, people are looking to me and people like me and people from my profession and saying, well, what does the law say? What does the law permit? Should we be petitioning to reform or amend the law? The law, the law, the law, the law. And as a practicing barrister, I'm often finding myself, particularly in conversations with clients such as Kevin, dealing with an absence of law. And I'm not just talking about loopholes, ambiguities, questions of interpretation, which lawyers are well familiar with. They are integral to any kind of legal practice, is that you're working with interpretations and loopholes and ambiguities and the need for clarification and perhaps better drafting and better wording. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about the total absence of a traditional legal framework. And I believe, in answer to Kevin's question, when he says, why are the best education systems being held hostage by some of these pernicious ideologies, the transgender ideology being the obvious case in point? And I'm going to put an answer to Kevin now, and then I'm going to turn to Philip's talk, and then I'm going to start my talk, if that's all right. So the answer to your question, Kevin, is human rights is the problem, all right? Now, before I turn to Philip and what he said, which was very helpful as a segue into my talk, let me just clarify, and this is a controversial position, as far as I'm concerned, human rights is a mechanism that disguises itself as a legal mechanism. So it's very common for us to think about human rights as a legal regime, a legal rubric, a legal framework. And that's why we talk about human rights law. And of course, the word right itself has a very established position within traditions of talking about law and jurisprudence. But I say to you, this is a deception. I say, and you know, I stand to be corrected, and I'm not trying to impose this on anybody, but this is my personal opinion, for which I may be struck off as a barrister at any minute, by the way, because there are now proposals to strike off barristers who do not show adequate commitment to equality, diversity and inclusion, which of course is a human rights apparatus. But I say, as a matter of personal opinion, protected as I am by Article 10 of the Convention on Human Rights, so Bar Standards Board if you're listening, what I say is that human rights law is a non-legal, quasi-legal, pseudo-legal apparatus And it is the mechanism through which traditional legal structures and consensus building in democratic societies such as our own are being radically dismantled and binned, frankly. Now, I'm going to elaborate hopefully on that in ways that will make what I say make more sense, because I'm aware that it may not be clear where I'm going at this point, but bear with me. Philip, if I may take the liberty of summarising in one paragraph, paraphrasing what I think was for me a very important point, which I hope I can do justice to. So I'm sort of quoting him, but I'm paraphrasing. Philip said that schools pay lip service to something he called British values, whilst at the same time smuggling identity politics or identitarian politics under veil of secrecy, and you used the word secrecy a number of times, and via unscrutinised third sector actors into so-called education. So what I took from that is that we have two paradigms here. If we're going to speak about schools specifically, and if we're going to speak about indoctrination in schools, I would like to take that point that Philip made and just have us all reflect on the two paradigms that we are dealing with. On the one hand, what Philip referred to as British values. We might quibble about what that means, but I think from a legal perspective, it's quite clear what that means, and I'll turn to that in a moment when I start to define indoctrination. That's the one paradigm, British values. On the other hand, we have identity politics smuggled into schools under veil of secrecy, often with the assistance of third sector actors. Now, I'm going to put it to you that what Philip meant by British values is a traditional democratic conception of the rule of law, and what he referred to as secretive identity politics is human rights. Okay, so now it's my job to try and unpack that a little bit for you, because obviously it's not self-evident, and I'm not saying it's self-evident even to me. As I said to Lucy at the beginning, I thought I would take advantage of today's event by simply workshopping a thesis with you, rather than saying the same old things that people may have heard me say before. So if this thesis is not honed and sharp, then you must pick me up on that, and hopefully we'll have some time to talk about it in more detail. But let me talk about the rule of law and what Philip called British values. I would like to frame the idea of the rule of law and British values under the umbrella of something that we might call, and it's quite appropriate for an AGM, I think, what we might call the old Constitution. Now, the old Constitution, such as we understand it using phrases, well-worn phrases like the rule of law, invokes concepts such as checks and balances, separation of power, the principle of equality only insofar as all have access to make representations before the law, and primarily accountability. And that's going to be important because we were talking earlier about secrecy, and these are two opposing valences, if you will, secrecy and accountability, as Claire Page knows only too well. So accountability is the way in which you prevent power from being exercised arbitrarily, and it is the way in which the law becomes a servant of the democratic body politic, because the law is a mechanism for building consensus. It is a way in which parties come to the table and start to batter out what is meaningful for them and their own interests versus what is meaningful for another party and their interests. Consensus building strikes compromises. It may have to rein some of its, one party may have to rein certain positions in, give or take, whatever. but there is an understanding in the traditional civic and civil understandings of the common law that the reason you have to have accountable, open systems of justice and that lawmaking has to be an open and accountable process is to stop special interest groups, primarily, I suppose, from seizing the legal mechanisms and other structures of state and corporate power and imposing their own vision of society onto the rest of us, often using heavy-handed mechanisms such as policing or even teaching in schools to enforce their political agenda. Now, this has to be done, obviously, in secret, because if it weren't, it would be open to scrutiny by definition and accountable, and therefore it would have to make its position clear, and it would have to answer to counter-narratives which push back where there are objections to particular agendas. So the old constitution then, through rose-tinted glasses, is a system that presumes the rule of law, it presumes checks and balances, it presumes open access, and it presumes accountability. And what I say is, it presumes that democracies operate through consensus building, where values are shared and differences are hammered out in the courts, but also in the classroom. Now, an example of a piece of legislation which I say belongs to what the French might call the Ancien Régime, or the Old Constitution, is the Education Act 1996. And I saw that it's cited in Lottie's report that you all have before you today. The Education Act 1996, as you well know, many of you, contains an absolute prohibition on political indoctrination. Now, what does that mean? Remember, I said that I think that the Education Act 1996 belongs to the old constitution, the old regime. But it contains an absolute prohibition on something. That doesn't sound like it's open to debate. It doesn't sound like it's allowing for much wriggle room. But let's look at the wording of it, shall we? So if you go to section 406 of the Education Act 1996, it says the local authority, this is subsection 1, local authority, governing body and head teacher shall forbid the promotion of partisan political views. The key word there, which indicates that the proper place of this legislation is in the old constitution, is the word promotion. It doesn't say that the teacher, head teacher, the governing body, the local authority shall forbid partisan political views. It says it shall forbid the promotion of partisan political views. That's huge. Now, if we're not sure where we're going with that, we turn to the next section, section 407, subsection 1, which is entitled The Duty to Secure a Balanced Treatment of Political Issues. The local education authority, governing body and head teacher shall take such steps as are reasonably practicable to secure that where political issues are brought to the attention of pupils, they are offered a balanced presentation of opposing views. So whilst we have on the one hand here an absolute prohibition on political indoctrination, nothing specifically is being absolutely prohibited, other than a refusal to see certain issues, which the legislation calls political issues, as contentious. And if a political issue is a contentious issue, which a political issue must always be, in fact, that is the definition of political, that which is contentious. Where there is a political view, i.e. a contentious view, the law says there is an absolute prohibition on pretending that it's not contentious. Now that I call the old regime, the old constitution, the rule of law. In a case, and it is the leading authority, and one might say it is the sole authority that we have that allows us to explore in more detail the meaning of sections 406 and 407 of the Education Act, is a case called 𝘧𝘧𝘦. Some of you will have heard of it. In that case, there was an objection to a video, a film, being played in the classroom and being mandated in the classroom, which discussed climate change on the grounds that the claimant felt that it was political propaganda and he didn't want it taught as fact. And it was important that the judge in that particular case said, we cannot have prohibitions on showing films on the grounds that they're political propaganda, because if that were the case, then you wouldn't, in a history lesson, be able to show a film, showing Nazi propaganda or Stalinist propaganda in order to discuss Stalinism and Nazism in their proper historical context. Teachers have to be able to show propaganda. What's important, and this was what 𝘧𝘧𝘦 made clear, following on from the provisions that I've just read to you of the Education Act, is that political propaganda cannot be taught as if it wasn't propaganda, i.e. it has to be taught in the context of a debate. And the students have to be allowed to understand what the issues within that debate are or were in order to understand the messaging that they're getting, for example, in a piece of propaganda footage. So I would say that the case of 𝘧𝘧𝘦 and the provisions of the Education Act 1996 give us a very suitable framework for robustly defending our schools and defending our young people from overzealous teachers, political activists in the classroom, and general political capture that we see across the wider society. And unfortunately for us, there's something called human rights. And with human rights, our old constitution, I'm afraid, is very difficult to not just rely on, but appeal to. It's very difficult to appeal to the old regime because the new regime has instilled itself as if it were a legal regime, as if it were democratic, as if it were in tune with all of the liberal achievements of the last 150 years. It's impossible to disconnect or to remove the parasite from the host. And I say that human rights is the parasite and common law is the host. Now, that means that we have to look at the new constitution then. The new constitution created by the parasitical burrowing activities of human rights and the human rights regime. If we were speaking earlier about the rule of law, I'm afraid when it comes to human rights, we cannot speak of the rule of law. We can only speak about rule by politics. And rule by politics is where a politically contentious view inserts itself as the consensus. How does it do this? Well, the first thing that has to be done is you have to get rid of accountability. You cannot have accountable, open structures of governance, not in healthcare centres, not in asylum centres, not in schools, not in Whitehall, not in the bar. Nowhere can there be accountability, open debate, discussion, consensus building, all of those things. There has to be a secret smuggling in, to use Philip's concept, smuggling in of identity politics under veils of secrecy and installing them as if they were the democratic consensus about what it means to be a legal democracy. So accountability has to go. So let's look at the schools as a context now for what we're talking about, because we are talking about indoctrination in schools today. And if we look at the last few decades, what we've been seeing, twofold, is an increasing clampdown on the ability of parents and guardians to access content. And this, Claire Page knows only too well. This has been her battle for God knows how long. And you have a popular Twitter handle which is called No to Secret Lesson Plans. So there's that word again, secret. Why on earth would it be so important to stop parents seeing content? I mean, the more you think about it, the more you have to ask. I mean, there's no liberal or rational justification for this. Well, Claire, maybe you can correct me.
I'm just going to add a time correction.
Yeah.
They don't mind us seeing it. They mind us acting on it.
Right.
So they put in place the option to see it, maybe in secret ourselves or in a roundabout way, go into a school, have a look. It's acting on it they don't want. So that...
Yeah, but that might be, even that seeing it might just be because of the pushback. I mean, in an ideal new constitutional world, parents just wouldn't be bothered. Unfortunately, for the new regime, parents are bothered. People like yourself make a nuisance of yourself and you want to see the plans. But in an ideal world, you just wouldn't. You would leave it to the people that know best and you'd stop getting involved. And that's the key, the crucial point I want to make, is that content is being redefined. Lesson content is being redefined as that which should not properly be the business of the democratic polity. We're just not supposed to know about it. And if we do want to poke our noses into it, we're made to feel as if we're very unwelcome. So this secrecy of lesson content is an indicator that we're dealing with the new constitution. Another thing that we've seen, and this has also been mentioned by Philip, helpfully for me, is the growth of a third sector industry. You can call it NGOs, you can call it quangos, you can call it charities, pretend charities, we call it what you like, but these are, again, people that we don't know who they are. Who are they? When were they founded? Who are the people that run them? Who designs their resources? Who among them is going into schools? What gives them the qualifications to be going into schools? And discussing, as we've seen with the transgender issue, sometimes issues that are clearly clinical or in nature and overlap with, for example, medical prescription. Right? On what basis are people going into schools, with or without the assistance of the teachers, the head teachers, the local authority, and adopting this expertise, this position of expertise? Well, the reason they can do it is because we don't know who they are. Again, the third sector is part of the culture of secrecy that is replacing the old constitution, which is based on scrutiny and accountability and consensus building. So I've talked about then the old constitution and the new constitution, and I've said that human rights for me represents the new constitution ruled by politics, where a legal regime or a pretend legal regime adopts the position of being the law. And it's in fact a political agenda, and that political agenda is presented as if it is based on the democratic consensus. And there are two ways in which human rights succeeds as a replacement for our traditional constitution. One, by erecting wall after wall after wall after wall of secrecy, which is why we're having the prohibitions on parents getting access to lesson content, and also the smuggling in of this mercenary army into the schools. Individuals that we don't know who they are, we don't know how they're qualified, we don't know what gives them the jurisdiction over our young people, but in they go, and they have, within the framework of RSE, or RSHE, or whatever you want to call it, this week, next week, they have a complete remit to teach whatever they want to teach. Because as we know, the government has said, you must teach LGBT, but nobody knows what it means to teach. Because as someone said, how's that education? Education isn't teaching LGBT. What place does that have? But I mean, LGBT is a human right issue, remember. You've got something called the Equality Act, 2010, which sets out protected characteristics which appear on the surface of things to be just immutable things that make us all human, and we all have them, but we're different, but we're the same. So we all have race, and we have sex, and we have a sexual orientation, and so on and so forth. But we all have rights to those things as well. We have a human right not to be racially discriminated against. We have a human right not to be treated in a sexist way. We have a human right to pursue the object of our affections without discrimination or stigma. These are human rights. So they're not immutable characteristics. They are structures within the emerging human rights regime which are presented as immutable characteristics, i.e. you can't debate. You can't debate. So LGBT is a human rights agenda. We've seen, it's actually, Peter Tatchell said it's the most successful human rights movement in the world, bar none, which is true. So this human rights agenda, which uses LGBT to sort of get its mojo going, is smuggled into schools, and it's taught as an educational agenda. And what I'm trying to say is that it can only be done through secrecy. And the other side of it is, and this is where human rights becomes really important, is that it can also only be done through shaming tactics. And this is why the human rights element is so important. Because if we think about what we understand human rights to be, I've suggested to you that you've been taught that it's a legal apparatus, it's a legitimate extension of the democratic consensus. It's a natural consequence of all the struggles that we've seen in democracies where groups of people have won bargaining power against all odds because of systemic discrimination and oppression in the past. That's not what human rights is. That isn't what human rights is at all. Human rights is the assertion of a political dogma that says thousands of years of oppression have been suffered so that X person can say X thing, and if you contradict it, then you are basically reenacting centuries of oppression. You are turning back history. You are abandoning all the liberal credentials that this democratic country stands for. So all human rights does is say there cannot be a discussion, because if you have that discussion about something so fundamental as the right to be gay, you are questioning homosexuality, you are potentially challenging it as a lifestyle, and you might even be committing genocide against LGBT people, inadvertently. And now I say go back to the wording of the Education Act 1996. Just go back to it and see suddenly, just see how foreign it sounds after what I've said now. The local authority, the governing body and head teacher shall forbid the promotion of partisan political views. The promotion. Where political issues are brought to the attention of pupils, they are to be offered a balanced presentation of opposing views. It's another world, isn't it? It's another world, which is why we cannot easily rely on the Education Act 1996. Because when you raise it, when you go to government ministers, when you talk to SPADs, when you have consultations in the House of Lords, when you meet people who are sympathetic to the idea that political indoctrination in schools is a problem, and you mention the Education Act 1996, there's a sort of cloud passes over their faces. It's almost like the light is fading in their eyes. And you think, what is the problem? It's good legislation. It's not even that old. And you think, I know. because it's totally incompatible with human rights regimes. And because it's totally incompatible with human rights regimes, because it insists that there's a debate, it insists that we are not all agreed on the question of LGBT liberation. We certainly aren't agreed on whether people can be born in the wrong body. And on questions of faith, which is why we have that withdrawal clause that allows parents to withdraw their children from sex education, precisely because it's recognised that different faiths will have a different position on what is taught in the name of the birds and the bees. That's why that's there. But human rights just circumnavigates that and says, well, let's just pretend that there's no such thing as faith, there's no such thing as controversy. And how they've got around it is by saying, well, you can take your children out of sex education, but you've got to make them stay for relationships education. Nobody has a Scooby-Doo what the difference is. When is a class sex education? When is it relationships education? Added to which, the most egregious aspects of this human rights dogma that I've been talking about is ushered in specifically through these washy concepts of social hygiene, health awareness, mental health awareness, relationships, being clean in the world, dressing yourself, knowing your body parts, knowing everybody else's body parts, sniffing your anus, all of these things. They create this wishy-washy sort of framework called relationships, which they say you cannot remove your child from that. But you may take the child out of sex education. Well, sex education doesn't exist now. Again, sex education belongs to the old regime, where it was recognised that faiths would differ about what was taught in the name of the birds and the bees. So what they've done is they've whole cloth imported something called human rights. And how have they done that? And I am coming to the end. How have they done that? They've done it through the Equality Act 2010. They've done it through the Equality Act 2010, which was a codified, again, deeply un-English in my humble opinion, a codification of random characteristics which loosely can be interpreted on a human rights basis. So the protected characteristic of race speaks to the victory of racial equality movements in recent history, let's say post civil rights movement in the United States. We have a series of laws in the Anglosphere which are dedicated to eradicating racial segregation, racial discrimination. So there is a whole understanding that rights were won by people who had been racially discriminated against. So the protected characteristic in the Equality Act says, right, well, race, that's there. So if anybody starts asking questions about what we're teaching in the name of the protected characteristic of race, you will be denying the right of people of colour to the vote and to live in an integrated way with other people. You're basically bringing back slavery. You're basically, doing all of the things that we associate with the worst excesses of racial apartheid in recent history. Similarly with sex, you've got this report about toxic masculinity. You've got the protected characteristic of sex, which means that whatever's taught in school cannot be debated around the protected characteristic of sex. Because if you debate what the school is teaching, which is that, it's really important to be aware of sexism and toxic masculinity and rape culture and all of these things, then as a parent you will be told you are not part of the democratic consensus, because you believe in white supremacy and patriarchy. And that's not what the school believes, it's not what the country believes, it's not what the society believes. You're out of step, you're far right, you're a minority, you can be written off. So you see how the human rights apparatus, which has been imported into schools via the Equality Act, allows for schools to teach anything they like within this wishy-washy framework of RSE, and any parent who questions it, on any grounds, immediately is cancelling 150 years of civil emancipation movements. They must be somehow pro-slavery, pro-patriarchy, feudalism, I don't know what, pro-Ku Klux Klan. They are regressive by definition because they're questioning the content that their children are being taught. And this is how it works. It's extremely subtle. Now, the question that we should be asking when it comes to actually doing something about it is, well, why the hell is the Equality Act anything to do with schools in the first place? I mean, there are so many pieces of legislation, there's so many laws, there's so many, reports, there's so many statistical surveys, there's so many things that exist in the world. Why are children being, from an increasingly younger and younger age, being told that they have to memorise certain provisions of the Equality Act and learn the protected characteristics as if they were species of birds? I've seen children coming home with homework where they have to write down these protected characteristics, and it's not as if they're even easy for lawyers to remember, I have to say. So I think as an activist point, we need to sort of think about, how did we get to the point where we all just accepted the Equality Act was actually suitable content for teaching? Since when did children have to study pieces of legislation and memorise provisions? I mean, they don't have to study, the Criminal Damage Act. They don't have to study the Magna Carta, although, it'd be good if they did. But they have to study the Equality Act. They have to memorise the protected characteristics. The teachers have to study the Equality Act. The teachers have to memorise the protected characteristics. There are posters all around the school with the protected characteristics listed. It's not just flags we have to worry about and lanyards. It's these the doctrine of protected characteristics in being imposed on students. It has a primary function, and the function is not to get the students to remember the protected characteristics, because frankly it doesn't matter whether the student does or doesn't. Of course a 6-year-old isn't going to reel off 9 protected characteristics, including pregnancy and maternity and what have you. That's not the point. The point is to instill in both children and parents the understanding that human rights is the framework for all institutional and public life now, including schools. And whatever is done within the framework of that institution cannot be questioned, because to question human rights is to question the very existence of vulnerable groups of people who have spent the last millennia fighting for democratic inclusion and justice and emancipation and liberation and all of those tropes that we hear time and time again in respect of, women and people of colour and LGBT people. I mean, these are abstract categories. They don't exist in the real world. The point is, if you have a question with little Johnny being told that he has to lick little Julia's anus as part of his homework, if you have a problem with that, then you are somebody who is pro-patriarchy, as I say, pro-white supremacy and pro-repression of homosexuals. So it puts people in a double bind, and it's very mutually reinforcing, because of course Claire has been stellar in campaigning for the walls of secrecy to come down and to have access to those materials for all parents, not just herself. But of course, the more a parent is told that you are politically a pariah if you question, the less parents will want to even engage with the school or even dare to voice their objections, and so the wall of secrecy gets thicker and thicker and stronger and stronger. So I think what I wanted to basically say to you today is that in answer to Kevin's question, why are centres of excellence, places, countries with the best education systems, why are they allowing pernicious ideologies to infiltrate them, and why are they having such a powerful effect? The answer is because to question these things, first of all, you have to get past the wall of secrecy, and secondly, you risk being shamed as the worst possible perpetrator of human rights abuses that the world has ever seen. So you are literally Hitler if you do not have, if you are not completely on board with what is going on in RSE. This is why we are so concerned at this point about indoctrination. It's not because we all think that there's one view and that our schools are teaching the wrong view. We are all adults in the room, and we know that amongst us here there will be differences of opinion on key issues, and we don't expect a school to know what the correct view on anything is. But if we go back to the old constitution and we look at the language of the Education Act, we can see that there is a really sensible mechanism for dealing with that, which is that there are multiple views. The teacher is the chair of the discussion, not the Führer. And I think that transition from the old constitution to the new constitution is what we must oppose. We must oppose human rights law and its increasing encroachment into our old traditional legal system, its dismantling of our traditional legal principles. And we have to understand why schools are promoting the Equality Act in the rabid way that they are. We must understand that as part of the way in which the new constitution expands itself. So unfortunately, I think our activism must start with getting the Equality Act out of schools, getting the Equality Act out of our law, total repeal, and getting human rights, ultimately, those sunny uplands beckon, but ultimately getting human rights out of our good old common law fabric, upon which we have traditionally, not always perfectly, but we have traditionally built consensus in ways that left the subjects and citizens of this country feeling part of a conversation, not shut out behind a wall of secrecy. Thank you very much.